Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Wi-Fi's role in connecting America. My name is Edgar Figueroa, and I'm President and CEO of Wi-Fi Alliance. We are thrilled today to be co-hosting this event alongside NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, and the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, or WISPA. This program will showcase the crucial role that Wi-Fi has played over the past year in mitigating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that has dramatically altered life as we know it. Our esteemed speakers today will demonstrate the economic value of Wi-Fi in the United States and the role that Wi-Fi plays in bridging the digital divide. Next slide, please. We will be joined today, there you go. We'll be joined today by two distinguished guest speakers, Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico and Senator Thune from South Dakota. The senators comprise the bipartisan leadership of the Communications, Media, and Broadband Subcommittee of the Senate Commerce Committee. I will follow the senators in sharing some perspectives from the Wi-Fi industry, and then we'll hear from Daniel Pineris from NCTA and Christina Mason from WISPA. So Makina, if we could go to the housekeeping slide. Yes. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded. The recording and the slides that we'll show you today will be shared with all participants after the webinar. If you cannot hear the presentation, please go to the audio and video tab at the bottom of your screen and click on the microphone icon to receive additional instructions on how to connect your audio. We will be showing a video during this webinar, so please be sure to turn up your computer's volume and make sure the volume bar on the video itself is turned up when the video comes on. Attendees will be muted throughout, and in the interest of time, questions will be answered after the presentation. Please use the Q&A function located at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you have a question to submit. And now I'm honored to introduce our first speaker, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, a native of Nambe, a small farming community north of beautiful Santa Fe, New Mexico. Senator Lujan is the chairman of the Communications, Media, and Broadband Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over Wi-Fi and spectrum policy. Senator Lujan was first elected to Congress in 2008. He previously served as U.S. Representative for New Mexico's 3rd Congressional District and as House Assistant Speaker in the 116th Congress. Senator Lujan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, Edgar, good morning, and it's an honor to be with you as well. To everyone else that is joining from across the country, and to my fellow New Mexicans that have joined today, I want to thank Andy Jones, who was once part of my team, for reaching out and making sure the people across New Mexico were participating today. And as I join you today's event virtually, the importance of broadband cannot be understated. Throughout this pandemic, we've seen just how important it is for our communities to be connected and to be able to access the internet. From students keeping up with their assignments, to parents working from home, to our first responders working to keep our communities safe. My personal mission is to ensure 100% connectivity across America, and that was a goal of ours, as you know, that began before the pandemic. As a result of COVID-19, we now all know the urgency and the importance of getting this done. As many of you at NCTA, the Wi-Fi Alliance, and the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association have been crucial partners in building momentum to bridge the digital divide and invest in broadband, your work has been especially important during the pandemic, providing up-to-date health information for Americans, working to connect our students to distance learning, driving innovation, promoting job training programs in the telecommunications workforce. And I know you've made a real difference in the lives of Americans, and there's more work to do. In my home state of New Mexico, we know the difference between fast internet, slow internet, and no internet. According to data from the FCC, more than 60% of New Mexicans living on tribal lands, more than 50% in rural communities, lack access to high-speed fixed broadband. And yet you can fly from Los Angeles to LaGuardia or to Miami International and stay connected to the internet at 30,000 feet. Meanwhile, communities on the ground that you may be driving through, you wouldn't be able to stay connected. I believe that's unacceptable. Not in the United States of America, not anywhere. Not being able to connect to the internet, especially during a pandemic, undermines businesses' ability to thrive, students' ability to learn, workers' ability to telework, patients' ability to seek healthcare, or being able to save someone's life. Think about Amber Alert systems, missing and murdered Indigenous women. Connectivity is not just about commerce and being able to chat. It will save lives. And I'll tell you what this means for my constituents and why it's important that we work together to drive broadband investments. Recently, one of my constituents, a junior high student in a tribal community in New Mexico, shared a story with me. They were sitting outside his high school in the hot summer sun to be able to get access to the internet while his school was delivering 100% distance learning. He was outside so long that he had a heat stroke. Now, I want you all to think about that for a moment. Students that were looking for every opportunity to be able to stay connected, and especially now that schools were having 100% distance education, they looked for every parking lot they could find. They looked for every hotspot they could find anywhere they could. Because in some of these communities, while we still also have to connect everyone with electricity, broadband is just something that is not available at home. And we've got to change that. A young student had a heat stroke because he had nowhere else to connect to the internet to complete his assignments. It's stories like these that drive me every day in the United States Senate, where I'm now humbled to serve as the chair of the Commerce Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband. I'm hopeful that we'll see robust bipartisan cooperation on the subcommittee to deliver results for our constituents to finally reach 100% connectivity in America, because failing to do so will have real consequences for the communities that we all represent. I've also been proud to get to know and to work with the ranking member of the subcommittee, Senator John Thune, who you'll hear from later this morning. We represent two rural states with unique broadband challenges, and there's a real desire to work together in a bipartisan fashion. Recently, I worked with Senator Lindsey Graham to include bipartisan legislation to provide E-rate support for school bus Wi-Fi to help close the homework gap while students travel on their daily school bus routes. Now, some folks may mock this and say it's something small, but for students who have to travel 2 hours one way to school, they understand the power of being able to connect on their buses. And you know who else likes it? The bus drivers. Students are a little more attentive. It's a little more quiet on those buses, and students are getting to work. It's incredible to see, and that's why this should be included. For rural and tribal students who travel hours to and from school, these commutes can be valuable time accessing the internet, completing assignments, and conducting research. A December study estimated that nearly 17 million students are stuck in the homework gap without internet access at home to complete their school assignments. Empowering our schools to equip buses with Wi-Fi is an opportunity to uplift our students, tackle the homework gap, and help alleviate the financial strains that too many families are experiencing at home. It's just one of those many ideas that has to be included to get the job done. Now, I was proud to also work with my colleagues to secure broadband investments in the American Rescue Plan. $10 billion for critical infrastructure, including broadband. $7.1 billion to support E-rate and remote learning to address the homework gap. $1 billion for technology modernization fund, and $200 million for the U.S. Digital Service. And I'm hopeful that the American Jobs Plan will include robust broadband investments to connect our communities and help Americans recover and rebuild. It's going to be game-changing. This could be the largest investment in broadband and in internet connectivity that America has ever seen. The Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act, authored by House Majority Whip Clyburn, is a good starting point. I was proud to help work on that legislation when I was in the House, and it's going to be important that we get that package also included. Let's be clear. Broadband is infrastructure. Don't believe anyone that tells you different. I look forward to working together to accomplish these goals and ensure 100% connectivity across America. I hope that you're a willing partner to get that done, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you this morning, and I hope you have a successful event. Thanks again, Edgar.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. It's great to hear of your terrific commitment to Wi-Fi. So we look forward to some positive outcomes there. Next, we will hear from Senator John Thune from South Dakota. Senator Thune has been a longstanding Wi-Fi champion along Representatives Matsui, McNerney, Lada, and a host of other members. on key issues for the Wi-Fi community, including promoting favorable policy for unlicensed spectrum and supporting the FCC decision last year to open the 6 gigahertz band to Wi-Fi. Senator Thune has served in the United States Senate since 2004. In addition to being ranking member of the Communications, Media, and Broadband Subcommittee, he currently serves as the Minority Whip in the 117th Congress. And just as a reminder, please turn up your computer volume for Senator Thune's recorded message, which follows.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to address you today as you gather virtually to discuss the important role of Wi-Fi technology. First, thank you to the entire telecommunications industry who've worked to keep us connected during the coronavirus pandemic. We've seen more than ever how important reliable internet connectivity is for doing our jobs, accessing healthcare services, and staying connected to our family, friends, and communities. Last Congress, I served as chairman of the Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, Innovation, and the Internet, where I focused on expanding reliable broadband services, laying the groundwork for 5G services, and ensuring that all technologies have access to the necessary spectrum. And this Congress, I'll serve as ranking member of the same subcommittee, but with a new name, the Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband. In this role, I'll have the opportunity to build on my previous work expanding internet access to all Americans. As everyone here today knows, licensed and unlicensed spectrum is the lifeblood of communications services. Unlicensed spectrum is responsible for transmitting a significant amount of the data in our networks and will play a tremendous role in the continued development of the Internet of Things. Additionally, as 5G networks are deployed, unlicensed spectrum will play an increasing role in the handoff traffic originating or terminating on licensed spectrum. I was pleased to see the FCC under Chairman Pai's leadership open up the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed use. I hope the equipment is certified for and deployed in this band as soon as possible, and that the FCC proceeds with rule changes that would make the band even better for unleashing new American innovations and investments. As I mentioned before, telehealth has brought greater access to care for rural Americans. Congress recognized the importance of telehealth services by providing critical funding to the FCC's COVID-19 telehealth program. For many rural Americans, like those in my home state of South Dakota, a healthcare visit often means hours on the road. Telehealth is improving all of that, and that is only a reality because of the access of Wi-Fi technology. Looking beyond the pandemic, I'm excited to see new cutting-edge technologies like precision agriculture and AVs, which will all be supported in part by the next generation of Wi-Fi services. And I look forward to continuing my work on spectrum policy this year by making sure we have proper management of this limited resource. Simply put, if we don't have efficient and effective management, we won't have enough of the right kinds of spectrum available. As we consider proposals to make specific spectrum bands available for licensed and unlicensed use, we must also ensure that our policies and procedures keep spectrum in the pipeline. Thank you again for the opportunity to share some of the work Congress has been doing to support communication services, and I look forward to working with all of you to make sure more Americans benefit from the innovations of technology supported by Wi-Fi.
Next, we will hear a few updates and perspectives from industry representatives. If during the next presentations you think of a question you would like addressed, you may submit that into the Q&A box right there at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You may need to click on the Q&A box there to open up that function. I'll be first up, and I'm honored to be presenting today our Wi-Fi Alliance perspective, where I'll highlight the economic value that Wi-Fi contributes into the U.S. economy, the central role for Wi-Fi in the United States telecom infrastructure, and the general role that Wi-Fi has had during the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that by doing that, I may provide you with some interesting context, and at the same time, set the stage for our subsequent speakers, Danielle and Christina. So if we could go to the next slide, let me first introduce Wi-Fi Alliance. We are, of course, the global network of companies that brings you Wi-Fi. Our high task is to shepherd how Wi-Fi evolves and advances. We've been doing that since the beginning in 1999, when we first agreed on the initial recipe for Wi-Fi and the name for what today is one of the most popular technologies there is. Wi-Fi Alliance has over 900, about 900 member companies that span the Wi-Fi ecosystem. We work to address any obstacle to market growth and on enhancing the user experience. Our collaboration yields innovation that results in better Wi-Fi, better experiences, more applications, which in turn results in commercial success that allows our market to continue growing in what's a virtuous cycle for consumers, for the industry, and for society. So on the next slide, we just capture the topics that I mentioned I will cover today, so we can move to the first one. And I thought I would start with the Wi-Fi economic value, if we click on the next slide here, because it provides a good starting context about why we should care about Wi-Fi and the Wi-Fi industry. So on the first slide, slide 5, we just capture some data points to give you a sense for the scope of Wi-Fi in 2021. So please note, this is not a forecast. This is where we are this year. Wi-Fi is truly a remarkable, probably one of the remarkable success stories of the internet age. And the Wi-Fi industry is not only amazingly diverse, but it's astronomically large. So if you click through, I just wanted to point a couple of data points, right? One is that there are more than 2 Wi-Fi devices in use today for every man, woman, and child in the world. And every year, we are infusing into the market an additional 4 billion Wi-Fi devices every year. If you just look at the latest version of Wi-Fi, which is Wi-Fi 6, that version of Wi-Fi, there will be more than 2 billion products that will be shipped into the market this year. So even just that segment, that one capability is a mass market of its own. In terms of product volumes or service utility, Wi-Fi eclipses other large industries because Wi-Fi is so horizontal that it spans many mass markets. For example, today it's hard to buy a television or a thermostat or a car or a phone without Wi-Fi. And increasingly, Wi-Fi is going into sensors that are enabling Industry 4.0 and farming equipment that exemplify IoT applications and the promise of IoT. Barbecue grills to virtual reality gear that offers a lot of promise. People rely constantly every day on Wi-Fi. And in fact, if we click through, there's a video that we put together that explains how users can't imagine a day without Wi-Fi now. It's become so essential to just everyday life and productivity. So on the next slide, we talk about the economic value study. Even though the Wi-Fi industry has been huge for decades now, and even though Wi-Fi services are essential, we found some years ago that the value, the economic contribution from Wi-Fi was rather underappreciated or underestimated in high places. And so a few years ago, we commissioned a study co-authored by 3 renowned economists on the economic contribution attributable to Wi-Fi around the world. In February this year, we updated that study and included some additional key economies. So we invite you to read some of these documents and the graphics associated with this latest publishing. You'll find a library of materials at the valueofwifi.org website that we created. On the next slide, we just set the stage for what we mean by economic value. And the 3 main pillars are consumer surplus, producer surplus, and GDP contribution. So on the next slide is the net, right, for the United States. In the US, Wi-Fi contributes close to $1,999 billion, in fact, US dollars, just in 2021. And if we project it out, that explosive growth in terms of the economic contribution from Wi-Fi that we've been on for the last 20 years is expected to continue in the period of the study for the next years. And in 2025, we expect Wi-Fi will be contributing in excess of 1.6 trillion US dollars into the economy. And another vector that we could look at is the jobs created in the US. In 2021, Wi-Fi accounts for over 540,000 jobs, growing to 720,000 by 2025. On the next slide, I won't spend too much time on this, but we mainly want to point first to some of the types of benefits and applications where Wi-Fi creates value. Some, such as revenues from Wi-Fi products, are obvious. Others, like savings from wired infrastructure that Wi-Fi makes unnecessary, a bit more hidden, but clear. And finally, others, like enabling automation, analytics, and new services are less apparent, though very important. So second, on this slide, you will note the scale of some of these economic value drivers, which is measured in hundreds of billions to trillions of US dollars. So again, we invite you to take a look in more detail at that economic value document. So the next topic was Wi-Fi, the telecom infrastructure. So just a couple of slides on this if we click through. We wanted to just bring to everyone's attention that for some years, Wi-Fi has been delivering more than half of all the data traffic going over the internet. And that proportion of traffic is growing, and it's expected to continue to grow for the next few years. This data that we're showing here just comes from a very popular study that Cisco publishes about every year. So on the next slide, we point to the foundational role, really, that Wi-Fi plays in mobile networks. So in every generation of cellular technology, from 2G to 3G, 4G, and coming up with 5G, the share of the proportion of traffic that's going over Wi-Fi has continued to grow. So even just focusing on mobile devices, the traffic over Wi-Fi is continuing to increase, and the share of that traffic going over Wi-Fi is growing. For every generation of cellular technology, and for 5G, Wi-Fi is expected to carry north of 70% of mobile traffic in 5G networks. So if you care about 5G, if 5G is important to you, then you should care about Wi-Fi, because 5G relies so heavily, primarily on Wi-Fi offload. And then the final topic here that we had was the Wi-Fi role in the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope to paint a picture here for what we've observed over the past year, starting with just sharing a lot of stories about how our Wi-Fi community, our Wi-Fi industry stepped up big to the challenge over the past year. From eliminating data caps to waiving many fees to supporting an explosion of telehealth applications to protect patients and healthcare workers, to donating time, equipment, and money, and prioritizing connectivity for first responders. There are countless examples of how the Wi-Fi community recognized there was a special role for us to play this past year where we could help, and we accepted that challenge and stepped up. So on the next slide, and in the next few slides here, we will cover some analytics from some of our member companies. So if we click through to the next slide. Here we have some data that captures the trends that we saw that were notably different during the pandemic period. So on the graph on the left there, you see that the global Wi-Fi traffic exploded starting around the time when we went into lockdown mode and work from home mode, increasing by about 80% overall. The number of Wi-Fi connections itself increased somewhere between 30 and 40%. During the workday from 9 to 5, that traffic increased from 70 to 94%. And overall, the data consumption increased by 62% per household per day. So these are numbers that are at a different scale, obviously, than we had seen before the pandemic. But the good news is generally Wi-Fi delivered. On the next slide, you can see that this is based on a study from Plume on the left here. Most of the data on this graph, it talks about the number of Wi-Fi connections and the number of Wi-Fi devices that also rose notably during the pandemic. So a different angle, not based on traffic, but just based on how many devices were on the network. And that rose by a lot this past year. So we see there that the number of active home devices grew somewhere between 50 to 90%, depending on the city, depending on the state, et cetera. and the active online Wi-Fi users grew by more than 80% in the home. The report at the bottom should not surprise any of us. This is saying that from February to October last year, the video conferencing traffic spiked more than 300%. And obviously, this is from applications like WebEx, GoToMeeting, et cetera. So these last few slides that I went through, right, they're all about the burden that Wi-Fi networks, particularly Wi-Fi networks at home, dealt with over the past period of the past year. And this was not necessarily unexpected in terms of our Wi-Fi industry preparedness, right? We expected that over time there would be a gradual progression toward a reality where we would have to deal with so many devices and so much traffic. But 2021 brought all of that about unexpectedly fast. So what's the upshot? If we move to the next slide, Wi-Fi relies on spectrum that's limited and defined, as Senator Lujan explained. We have only been able, up to when the pandemic started, to use spectrum that was available, made available decades ago. And during this past year, demands spiked with many more users, more data traffic, and many new applications like Zoom. And with that kind of demand, when that happens on networks, because of many more users, many devices all operating at the same time, it's likely that then all the devices and all the users on the network will experience a degradation, right? A lowering of the quality of the experience that they're having, to a point where potentially the network, could collapse and really slow to a crawl. But we have good news. So moving on to the next slide, FCC made a momentous decision, a seminal decision, almost a year to the day, April 23rd, 2020, by allowing Wi-Fi to operate in 6 gigahertz. And this was really a shot in the arm to our ecosystem. It sort of becomes something so obvious that many other administrations around the world, including countries in the Americas, in Asia, and in Europe, have followed FCC's lead in making 6 gigahertz spectrum up to 1200 megahertz available for Wi-Fi, and recognizing that Wi-Fi is playing a critical role in propping up the national telecom infrastructure. So in response to that, industry galvanized to deliver new capabilities for Wi-Fi 6 operating in 6 gigahertz. This is something we are calling Wi-Fi 6E, and it's a technology that we were able to deliver in record time. And products are already being commercialized and emerging. You can already purchase mobile phones and access points and such with Wi-Fi 6E. And what that means is that we will be able to continue to stay ahead of demand so that we are able to avoid these networks collapsing. Wi-Fi 6E is going to bring better speeds, more capacity, better latency, and many such benefits that we can look forward to. Sometimes I've mentioned that this FCC decision is likely to take our industry from an era of bicycles operating in neighborhood streets to an era of superhighways with intelligent traffic management. So we're very excited about the prospect of new experiences that will be brought about with this Wi-Fi 6E and future technologies that will populate that 6 gigahertz spectrum. And even more thrilled at the prospect of all the innovation that will come from this new spectrum availability. So the next slide is my last slide, just in terms of a recap. In 2021, this year, Wi-Fi delivers nearly $1 trillion in economic value in the US, and also in the US, more than 500,000 jobs. Wi-Fi is used more than ever. It's integral to our telecom infrastructure and essential when we have a crisis like the pandemic. The FCC 6 gigahertz decision naturally enables ongoing Wi-Fi innovation and economic growth and performance enhancements. And with everything that our innovators and our entrepreneurs will do with newly available spectrum, it paints a bright picture for our future. So we're grateful for this, and very excited to discuss how this may evolve with our colleagues. So on the final slide, I just share some materials for reference in case you want to go ahead and read up a little bit more on 6 gigahertz, Wi-Fi 6, and any of the other topics I mentioned. So next, we will welcome Danielle Pineris to address us. She is the Vice President and Associate General Counsel at NCTA. Good morning, Danielle, and looks like you're ready. So if you are, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Good morning, Edgar, and good morning to all our panelists. Thanks so much for joining us today and for inviting me to speak. Edgar and I think we'll cover some of the same ground, but hopefully I can give it a little bit of give you all a little bit of a different viewpoint from the perspective of NCTA's member companies, which are cable operators and who deliver much of the broadband access in the United States, both from a fixed perspective into homes, but of course through Wi-Fi as well, which is really how most of us consume our internet today. Next slide, please. So the bottom line from our perspective, and NCTA's members have been tracking and reporting publicly on NCTA's website the kind of traffic growth that we've seen during the COVID pandemic. The bottom line is internet usage is up. That should be no surprise to anyone. He's observed significant growth in both downstream and upstream traffic during the pandemic, 30 to 40% during peak business hours, and even as much as 60% in some markets. This is very asymmetric traffic still, as you might expect. 93% of traffic remains downloads, downstream traffic, versus 7% upstream, despite that figure that Edgar mentioned of an increase of 300% in video conferencing on some networks due to applications like WebEx and Zoom. In some cases, our ISPs experienced years worth of anticipated network growth in just a matter of weeks as folks shifted from going into the office to a work from home environment. And ISPs were able to react quickly to the sudden demand increase by augmenting capacity to maintain performance, which really ultimately led to a resilient and reliable internet experience in the United States that we've all enjoyed and benefited from, and I think continue to do so today. Next slide. So this is a chart taken from NCTA's website. You can go to our national COVID-19 dashboard that has a lot more information about network performance overall during the pandemic. What you can see here is it charts the upstream and downstream growth over time. You can see there was an incredible jump in the March 2020 timeframe in both upstream and downstream traffic, which has stabilized over time. I think at the latest, be sure I have my information here, as of the latest date, April 10th, I believe, 2021, the total cumulative growth since March 1st, 2020 is 28.5%. That's for national downstream peak traffic, and national upstream peak traffic growth continues to experience surges and is up to a total of 49.4% since March 1st, 2020. And again, this is on NCTA member networks as well as data distributed by other internet service providers. Next slide, please. I think as most of us have experienced anecdotally, I think we all understand that while the data that we're reporting is on our fixed networks, most of us are experiencing our Wi-Fi, our broadband connection through our connected devices, through our laptops, through our smartphones and our tablets. And very rarely do we plug those in to our routers, to our modems, to the wall anymore. They're all untethered. They're all accessing the broadband via Wi-Fi. During the pandemic, we saw a real increase in Wi-Fi usage, and Edgar spoke to this. We have a little bit further information here to share with you. Just to note that 62% of employed Americans worked from home during the pandemic, which of course then led to increased broadband consumption, increased Wi-Fi consumption, in particular on residential networks. Edgar mentioned the increase in Wi-Fi connected devices. If you go to the Plume dashboard, and Edgar shows some of the stats from there, I'll show you a picture of the total active devices on home networks in a variety of markets. In some cases, the active Wi-Fi connected devices on these residential networks increased more than 100% in some of the major markets. In addition to more Wi-Fi connected devices, there's more overall Wi-Fi traffic. Edgar mentioned the statistic, 80% Wi-Fi traffic increase over pre-pandemic levels. In addition, NCTA member companies are seeing more mobile device consumption on in-home Wi-Fi. in some cases accompanied by a decrease in reliance on sort of traditional mobile use, LTE use within the home. So again, this makes more sense as folks are staying indoors, staying inside, as they're relying on their home networks, not traveling to the office or other places. They're connected to that residential Wi-Fi network. In particular, one member observed a Wi-Fi increase on mobile devices of approximately 36% since March 2020, while at the same time seeing LTE usage decrease by 17%. Next slide, please. So this is the Plume data that I mentioned. Again, you can go to the Plume's Wi-Fi work from home dashboard to see some additional information. But what you see here is the number of active devices at home in the United States in various markets. You can see there's a big jump in the number of devices right in that March 2020 timeframe when we all began working from home and learning from home and doing telehealth from home, right? Very few of us have just one laptop or one smartphone connected. We've got a couple of smartphones, one for work, one for home, a tablet, for the kid learning, the laptop for the parent working, the other parent working, the kids remote learning, something for telehealth, gaming. All of these devices are active on the home networks in a way that we just didn't see before. Next slide, please. In addition, Wi-Fi can help to close the digital divide, and I know that Christina will cover this in some detail from a wireless internet service provider perspective, but cable operators over the last year have also been very focused on ensuring that everyone has access to broadband and to Wi-Fi in a meaningful way. Cable operators opened up their public Wi-Fi hotspots at no cost early in the pandemic. Our members have also partnered with education superhighway and school districts to get kids online for remote learning. Comcast has recently committed to launch more than 1,000 Wi-Fi connected lift zones in community centers across the country to help students get online. And Midco uses fixed wireless access to connect unserved rural areas, some of which relies on unlicensed spectrum in the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands that we'll talk about. I know Christina has a lot more to add on the fixed wireless access piece as well. Next slide, please. So as Edgar mentioned, what powers all of this wonderful Wi-Fi that we all have experienced and relied upon during the pandemic? It's really Wi-Fi spectrum. It's that spectrum input that's critical to support all of this Wi-Fi traffic. None of the stats on the left will be a surprise to you. These are some of the things that Edgar covered. Wi-Fi carrying more than half of U.S. internet traffic today. That number is going to continue to grow. Wi-Fi supporting offload of more than 70% of mobile traffic over time. As Edgar put it very well, if you care about 5G, you've got to care about Wi-Fi. In order to obtain the speed and latency promises of 5G, you've got to have that Wi-Fi access to offload all of the traffic that's going to be transiting these 5G licensed spectrum networks. Americans continue to connect more and more devices to their networks. This was even, by pre-pandemic estimates, more than 13 connected devices per resident in the United States by 2023. And as I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, we as internet service providers, NCTA's members, care about Wi-Fi so much because it's how American consumers experience the internet. And the gigabit and multi-gigabit speeds, the 10G speeds, as we like to say at NCTA, that our members will eventually be able to deliver, those speeds have to make it all the way to the consumer device. They can't stop at the Wi-Fi router. The fixed wireless speeds, the fixed wireless or the fixed speeds that we can deliver through hybrid fiber coaxial networks or fiber networks, those can make it into the home, but if they're not making it to your tablet or your laptop or your smartphone, then that's a problem. So we've got to have enough spectrum to meaningfully support all of the traffic that's going out to those individual customer devices. So what do we need to do that? We need sufficient unlicensed spectrum to support wide bandwidth, 160 megahertz next generation Wi-Fi channels under technical rules for these different spectrum bands that foster. Next slide. So what's next for Wi-Fi policy? How do we get there? I talked a little bit about the FCC's 6 gigahertz decision, which I think all in the Wi-Fi community agree that was just a watershed moment for Wi-Fi in the United States and around the world, as other administrations have kind of followed the FCC's lead in looking at the 6 gigahertz band as kind of the future home for Wi-Fi growth and development. As Edgar mentioned, the FCC last year opened up 1,200 megahertz of spectrum to shared unlicensed access in the 6 gigahertz band. And the Commission also designated the lower 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band for indoor Wi-Fi use. And these additional unlicensed spectrum resources are critical to deploying those wide bandwidth 160 megahertz next generation Wi-Fi 6 channels that will enable multi-gigabit speeds. There's more to do here, right? There's always more to do with unlicensed spectrum. And here there are still some pending decisions that would further improve upon the FCC's decisions last year to enable meaningful and robust Wi-Fi deployments in these bands. I'll talk a little bit about kind of the contours of the FCC's 6 gigahertz decision and the meaning of that band for Wi-Fi. But there's a certain category of devices authorized in the 6 gigahertz band called low power indoor Wi-Fi devices. And there's an opportunity here for a power increase that could improve coverage for these devices by 45 to 75% on average, and throughput by 113 to 170% on average. That's really meaningful in terms of a single device's ability to provide whole home or whole business access versus deploy kind of additional hotspots or extenders within a home to get the full range and benefit of Wi-Fi that we see in other bands. In addition, the FCC has teed up the possibility of outdoor access to the 5.9 gigahertz band to foster a robust device ecosystem. And we think quick action on these two decisions could really help to build on the decisions last year and really enable meaningful and robust Wi-Fi deployments in these two really important spectrum bands. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show everybody a picture. This is a 6 gigahertz band picture, talking a little bit about kind of who's already there, what the rules are now for Wi-Fi after the FCC last year, and kind of what are the potential rule changes here that could enable even more robust Wi-Fi access. You'll see here that what the FCC did was adopt kind of two different spectrum access possibilities for Wi-Fi in the band. There's standard power Wi-Fi access, which is governed by what's called an automated frequency coordinator database to protect incumbent services in the band. That kind of Wi-Fi use is authorized in chunks of the band, kind of dark blue chunks you see in the picture. The FCC also authorized low power indoor Wi-Fi use without the need for a database across the full 1200 megahertz of spectrum, both the dark and the light blue bands that you see here. So this is really important. The FCC is thinking about how can we both protect the existing uses that are already in the band. Unlicensed devices like Wi-Fi, they're good sharers. We've been good sharers of spectrum for a very long time. And the FCC's rules that it adopted for the band really enable robust sharing with existing users, and also will facilitate Wi-Fi deployment throughout these 1200 megahertz. At the same time, as I noted, there's an opportunity here to enable higher power levels for low power indoor devices without the need for a database. The power levels here adopted for this band for these low power indoor devices are significantly lower than what the FCC has adopted in the past for Wi-Fi devices, for instance, in the 5 gigahertz band that's the most widely used today. So again, an opportunity for further action here to further improve upon the real watershed moment last year of adopting unlicensed access to the 6 gigahertz band. Next slide, please. So here's a picture of the 5.9 gigahertz band. You can see in dark purple on the right, this is kind of a zoomed out version of the 6 gigahertz band that we just saw. So what's interesting about the 5.9 gigahertz band is it's right next to both the most widely used Wi-Fi band in the world today, the Uni 3 band, which you see in light purple on the left, and is sort of squished in between that primary Wi-Fi band and the new 6 gigahertz band next door. The 5.9 gigahertz band was for a very long time designated for automotive safety use for a very specific technology that never really took off in the marketplace. And so the FCC decided last year that it would sort of have a compromise approach to this band to enable future auto safety innovations in the upper 30 megahertz of this 75 megahertz of spectrum, and enable shared Wi-Fi use in the lower 45 megahertz. And what's beautiful about this decision is that it enables the creation of a new 160 megahertz Wi-Fi channel that spans that existing band down below that's widely used but not quite big enough to get us to the critical 160 megahertz channel with the Wi-Fi band, with the new Wi-Fi spectrum, 45 megahertz, 5.9 gigahertz band next door. The other really important thing about this 5.9 gigahertz spectrum, it may look like a small chunk at 45 megahertz compared to the 1200 megahertz the FCC designated in the 6 gigahertz range. But we think this spectrum can be brought online in existing equipment. While the 6 gigahertz band equipment devices are being approved now, will be deployed over the next few years, because this spectrum is immediately adjacent to a widely used band, we think we can bring these frequencies online with a software firmware upgrade to existing devices, which again, in the context of growing Wi-Fi use in the pandemic, being able to alleviate some of that congestion with sort of an immediate shot in the arm with some existing devices, we think could be a real benefit to American consumers. So I just want to highlight, kind of wrap things up by kind of hearkening back to Edgar's statistics on the economic value of unlicensed spectrum. Those are big numbers, $1 trillion this year, growing to almost 1.6 trillion in the next few years. There's also been a study done looking at the specific value of the 5.9 and 6 gigahertz bands for unlicensed. By one measure, moving forward with proposals, the FCC's proposals for these bands could add more than $180 billion to the U.S. economy by 2025. So again, I think making sure that we can continue to improve upon these wonderful decisions that the FCC has made in the last year to enable robust Wi-Fi deployment of these new and exciting innovations that these wide bandwidth Wi-Fi channels will enable will be really important. We look forward to being a part of that conversation. And with that, I'll conclude. Next slide, and happy to turn it over to Christina.
Great, thank you, Danielle. Let me go ahead and introduce Christina. But first, good to know that NCTA is fully plugged in to how spectrum policy affecting Wi-Fi is evolving, and nice to get your thoughts on both 6 gigahertz and 5.9. So thank you for that. As Danielle mentioned, last but not least, we will hear from Christina Mason. She is the Vice President of Government Affairs at WISPA. I see you're ready, Christina, so good morning and welcome.
Morning, thank you. And Danielle, fantastic job, Edgar. Fantastic job, and it was great hearing from the senators earlier as we're all discussing today. As you see clearly, by the benefit of me going last, I get to hear exactly why this is so important we're discussing today. And so I get to back cleanup. I get to do the fun part of the entire presentation. You heard the statistics, you heard the economics, you heard the very detailed and completely accurate Danielle, fantastic job going over what can sometimes be wonky technology references when you're talking about spectrum. WISPA actually cares very much so about spectrum because we represent fixed wireless providers. So when we have 1,000 members who really deploy hybrid networks, there is a little bit of fiber in there and a mix of technologies, but the primary last mile of our technology delivery is fixed wireless technology. Next slide, please. And you may be asking, what is fixed wireless technology? I came here to hear about Wi-Fi's role in the pandemic, and why are we talking about, the digital divide and broadband, and what is the role, what is that relationship between Wi-Fi and broadband and the digital divide? Well, I'm going to answer that. Fixed wireless technology, FWA, you may see it in shorthand, with wireless, internet provider, WISP. There are many different ways people describe this technology: point to point, point to multi-point. We're going to use today fixed wireless as the term, but it's talking about delivery of high-speed internet through point to point or point to multi-point technology using spectrum. There's a multitude of spectrum bands that can be utilized to deliver this high-speed connectivity. Most of our members deliver it on an unlicensed basis, but there is an increase in licensed access for fixed wireless, and then licensed by rule, which is kind of a lightly licensed scenario. But essentially what these providers do is using some kind of microwave or fiber backhaul, they bring internet to largely three contexts. Obviously, let's go through the three that we usually know. So in the urban setting, there are fixed wireless providers. You may, if you live in the district, DC Access is a fixed wireless provider. Starry is also another urban fixed wireless provider. And in these contexts, they utilize a mix of spectrum, sometimes millimeter wave, sometimes 5 gigahertz if it's available, and not too noisy within the urban context, but they essentially put their equipment in a central high location, and then the customer equipment goes to on the either side of your building or your balcony, and you receive the internet wirelessly, amazingly enough. Hence the fixed wireless, terminology. In the urban context, we're seeing increasing growth of those deployments, but where we really see market penetration is in the more rural and ultra remote context, and that's more of the center, and then when you see that little cluster of homes all the way to the left, those are the more saturated markets for fixed wireless technology, because this is where it really makes sense. The economics work for fixed wireless in these rural and remote areas. And essentially you have areas where, if you think of a Nebraska, Wyoming, New Mexico, South Dakota, you have areas where you have miles and miles of communities who are either rural farming communities or just have large swaths of land between home and home, and you need to connect these communities to high-speed internet. Where it makes sense is using wireless technology, because as opposed to the high cost, admittedly, fiber, we have nothing against fiber. Fiber is a critical part of our hybrid networks. But when you get to the per mile cost of deploying this technology, it makes a lot of sense to use fixed wireless technology in these rural and remote contexts, because you can connect these communities to high-speed internet up to multi-gigabit, depending on what spectrum band you're using. When we're talking about that millimeter wave, obviously you're going to have a more micro pop presence in your little community, but you can get multi-gigabit connectivity using the spectrum, but you're able to connect these homes for a fraction of the price of, say, a fiber alternative. So while fiber makes a lot of sense, perhaps in this urban community, the first one we discussed, where homes are right next to each other and you get more bang for your buck for that deployment, when you're talking about the more rural and ultra rural, we're talking about remote. We're talking about not just your farming communities, but the folks who are really in the nether regions of Alaska. These folks can get high-speed connectivity where it makes economic sense even for the provider, because the equipment that goes into deploying this technology is a fraction of the cost. And particularly if you're using unlicensed spectrum, that there's no cost to the provider to deploy that to your home. So it makes a lot of sense when we're talking about all these proposals that consider broadband deployment, ideas, and how are we going to connect all of America? And you heard from Senator Lujan, his goal is 100% connectivity. We can do that. The challenge is that we have to remember that it will probably take a mix of technologies to do that, and fixed wireless is a key part of that technology. Next slide, please. So within the pandemic context, I think this is probably one of my favorite things to talk about. Obviously, the pandemic changed our lives probably forever, and there are a lot of things that came out of the pandemic that were learning areas for both providers obviously in us as consumers, as customers. All of us here, we are either working from home, our children are learning remotely. This is a very real context. And it's important to kind of put the stories together of understanding how this technology allowed us, all of us here on this call, to continue to work and learn and receive our telehealth appointments. More specifically, fixed wireless providers utilizing the 5.9 gigahertz band, they actually were able to get access to that band on a temporary emergency basis. So while the FCC was kind of going through their rulemaking, our providers were able to apply for what is a temporary STA, is a temporary access to the spectrum band, and we're able to deploy 5.9 overnight, because the important thing to note about the 5.9 gigahertz band is a lot of our equipment is already enabled to utilize the 5 gigahertz band. And just with a software upgrade, oftentimes, and just some quick programming, we're able to turn on the 5.9 gigahertz channel and overnight increase capacity. In a conservative basis, a lot of our providers, and this is actually direct from our STA folks, they average about 20 to 50% increase in capacity overnight. That means increase in speeds or even increase in customers. It depends on how they decided to deploy that 5.9, whether they were bringing on a new community altogether, or whether they were just making sure the capacity was increased, as we all saw earlier with, of course, the increase of demand on our connectivity. They wanted to make sure fixed wireless is up to speed, and of course it was. So it was really important that FCC granted these temporary authorities, but we are hoping that now that these communities are online, they're able to continue to have that connectivity even after the pandemic, after this emergency context. And with the FCC continuing its rulemaking, hopefully we'll see soon that this outdoor use, this very real example of how 5.9 can be used to bring these communities online. We've heard, again, this is anecdotally, this is not a study, of zero interference issues with the 5.9 being utilized in areas like Wyoming and New Mexico. In California, we are hopeful that that indicates that there is a path forward here where we can ensure that 5.9 is used to continue this connectivity, and every other use or incumbent in the band is protected, and that is obviously our primary goal. Fixed wireless providers are often obviously wanting to share spectrum band, but they also are often the incumbents in the band. 6 gigahertz is actually used as licensed high-speed backhaul. So when we're talking about, Danielle was talking about access to the 6 gigahertz, again, we want to ensure that there is limited interference and limited harmful interference to other incumbents, because we are those incumbents that we're trying to protect. So we both understand the importance of opening these bands up to unlicensed use, particularly within the pandemic and beyond, but we also understand the importance of protecting the incumbents in the band, because that's important. These uses can have duality and make sure that everyone can get what they need from the bands and continue. Another example of this wonderful, I have two more. Just go back, just two more. Really quick, to context of the pandemic, of the quick and affordable deployment of this technology is fixed wireless providers almost overnight set up connectivity in the beginning of the pandemic for COVID-19 testing sites. One of our favorite examples is in Mississippi. One of our providers partnered with the locality to connect Walmart parking lots for COVID-19 testing in the more rural communities. Obviously, the Walmart is sometimes an anchor of a community in these more rural counties. So they would set up these networks so that telehealth providers and actually in-person health providers could do the testing, quickly upload the information, and get all their systems in place. And this wouldn't have happened. You're not going to drag a fiber line to the Walmart parking lot. This is connectivity that happened because of the nature of fixed wireless technology. And then also within the school context, we have a provider in Texas who actually, and this is just one example of many, who partner with their local school district to ensure that all of the students in that school district had connectivity, again, overnight. As we all remember, in the early days, it was kind of when you were in office one day and then you never returned for a year. And same with the students. A lot of times the students on Friday left school and Monday they never came back. And they needed connectivity over that weekend. And so the school districts quickly realized, like, how can we quickly and affordably connect our students? And that's where our fixed wireless providers partnered with them by just placing radios on the students' houses and then bringing them online onto their network. They were able to provide high speed. This is 100 megabit download speeds, connectivity to students over a weekend. And they did that for free because it wasn't so much of an outlay that the internet service provider couldn't do it. So those are really good examples of the pandemic context. Next slide, please. So just to underscore this 5.9, you know, Danielle did a fantastic job, and I'm not going to rehash all the fine points that she made there, but I just want to highlight that from, you know, those pandemic context stories of utilizing 5.9 on a temporary STA basis, to kind of pull the picture together for you, fixed wireless providers largely use the unlicensed 5 gigahertz band. That's the workhorse for our delivery to get these communities exactly what we're talking about in rural and ultra rural areas connected. And then we are likely going to see 6 gigahertz coming down the pike, hopefully very soon, on an unlicensed basis. You know, on a coordinated basis as well, making sure incumbents are protected. But we'll have this 5 gigahertz and then 6 gigahertz, and then right in the middle is 5.9. So if you picture this like a highway, and we have all our cars, number one, we went from a 3-lane highway to a 6-lane highway or 8-lane highway. That alone alleviates congestion, traffic speeds up. We all know the context of having more space. But what's important to think about is 5.9 is a middle lane in that highway. So unless we have that unlicensed access to 5.9, even that little 45 megahertz, that may not, you know, Danielle said it doesn't sound like a lot. Essentially, if we're using this highway, you know, example, our cars on 5 gigahertz will have to jump over 5.9 to get to the 6 gigahertz highway to use it. If we just had that lane open, then our cars can freely move among all of these lanes and have fantastically higher speeds for our consumers. And I think that is the primary goal here. We want to make sure that all of our experiences, whether you're living in an urban community, or if you live in a rural, or if you live on that hill in Alaska, you should be able to access this high-speed connectivity, as we all know that's vital to our economic, as Edgar proved up earlier, and our health, our ability to maintain good health and lifestyles. We just want to make sure that this super highway, if you will, is available to all consumers and just opening up 5.9 would do that. Next slide, please. So the future of fixed wireless, you kind of, right now we're estimating without, just as an independent fixed wireless provider, about currently 7 million subscribers. And again, these are in largely rural in remote context. So that's a large market penetration when you bring in the relative context of those markets. We're not talking about New York City, DC, or LA. We're talking about, you know, remote areas of New Mexico. the future of fixed wireless connectivity, what we see is that the future is limitless. We're really excited at the prospects, particularly for the tribal communities that we're seeing coming online. Last year, tribal communities got access to 2.5 gigahertz, and they are now deploying that in a lightning fast context, and we'll see over the next 5 years an increase of those communities using fixed wireless technology. One of my favorite members, they're actually now becoming members of WISPA, is the Havasupai Tribe, who's located actually at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And for decades, literally decades, they've been trying to get connectivity to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. There have been number of barriers that they had to overcome. Number one, they're surrounded by a lot of federal land. They're surrounded by a lot of state land, and they're surrounded by a lot of privately owned land. So getting to their actual community on the actual, not at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, but just actually the backhaul was a challenge in and of itself, navigating all of those kind of jurisdictions. But then once you got to their land, they had a lot of sacred land and a lot of land that traditional infrastructure wouldn't be suitable. So dragging a fiber line or digging or trenching fiber or even hanging wires would not necessarily work for their context, even if they weren't at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And obviously being at the bottom of Grand Canyon makes it even more challenging. So once they got this access to the 2.5 gigahertz band, they were able to overnight connect their community to high-speed internet. That we're talking about folks who didn't even have, who barely can get mobile wireless connectivity at the bottom. They are now able to, we were on video conferencing. She was like, you have no idea how this is a game changer for our tribe. We're gonna start a high school soon. Because now that they have this connectivity, they're now able to have their own local high school. They have aspirations of even having a workforce training program and all of these wonderful things that now, just because they got that wireless connectivity, that they now can expand the potential for their whole community. And when we ask, like, hey, if you had to choose between fixed wireless or say fiber, where you get the top speeds all the time, and she said, we could never do fiber. It's a thing that does not exist for us because there is no way, even if we got through all the regulatory burdens to get to our actual tribe. We have sacred lands that we have to respect, and we'll never be able to have that kind of connectivity. So fixed wireless is our future. This is where we're going to go, and we just hope that we have increased access to spectrum. Their microwave backhaul they're working on now to increase the connectivity to go from, they're about 25.4 now. They're hoping to increase to 50 by 5 just because there's so much demand in the tribal community. And we see this going across the board with all the tribes. So as you see in 2025, that's 12.7 million figure. That doesn't even include also the mobile, the big mobile carriers who are using fixed wireless technology to deploy their 5G. Some folks are calling it fixed 5G, but in a lot of contexts, they are deploying this technology. Tribes are deploying this technology to get connectivity overnight. Our rural and remote communities are deploying this technology to keep folks online during the pandemic and beyond. We just want to make sure that we have a role in today and in the future, particularly as we continue these infrastructure talks, that spectrum is infrastructure. Senator Lujan, broadband is infrastructure. I would like to take it one more step and say spectrum is infrastructure. And as we're considering all of these proposals for broadband deployment, let's remember the important role that spectrum plays in connecting our communities. Thank you. I'll turn it back over to Edgar.
Thank you, Christina. And thanks for giving us your thoughts on fixed wireless networks. I'm like probably many in the audience, I learned quite a bit, and also interesting to hear your perspective on how Wi-Fi is the workhorse connecting some of these remote communities. And also interesting that both you and Danielle talked about 5.9 and how that bridging some of that bandwidth that we may need here very soon. So we have a few minutes for questions, and if anybody in the audience has any, I'll just remind you, there is a chat Q&A window there at the bottom right. Feel free to submit that. In the meantime, it looks like we may have one or two here. So maybe we can start with just a brief discussion about FCC's 6 gigahertz decision. So the question is, 6 gigahertz opened 1200 megahertz of spectrum for shared unlicensed use, which is 7 new 160 megahertz Wi-Fi channels. Can you talk a little bit about how that amount of spectrum will transform Wi-Fi and what kind of services we can expect to see from that band? So I don't mind kicking off, and maybe we can go around the table here. So I think to most people, as pretty much all of us said, Wi-Fi is synonymous with the internet. It's how we connect to the internet, right? The average consumer, they think internet, they just think it's Wi-Fi. And we got here because Wi-Fi has this unique combination of very high performance at low cost. It's available everywhere. Everything works together. But because it's become so popular, many of us had this worry, this dark cloud looming over our head that one day the Wi-Fi experience would crumble under its own popularity and all these increases in demands on Wi-Fi networks. So the first thing, for me is that the 6 gigahertz newly available spectrum is going to address that, initial risk, right? That we have more spectrum that then can deal with this explosion in traffic. And, as far as where we go from here, none of us has a crystal ball. When I started in Wi-Fi back in the early 2000s, it would have been unimaginable that we could have a web conference like this where most of us are relying on Wi-Fi to join. And so I think, in many measures, we've exceeded expectations with what we've been able to do with Wi-Fi and the spectrum that we've had for decades now. But if the past is any indication of where we're heading, I'm excited about the future because there's many areas where a lot of innovation is happening, like education, healthcare, collaboration, many areas, right? And so we're very excited about the promise of what entrepreneurs, engineers are going to be able to do with this new spectrum. I'll just mention an area that's emerging that we're hearing quite a bit about in the Wi-Fi industry, and it's around augmented reality and virtual reality. We probably all have heard that there's a lot of promise, again, in being able to apply those techniques to healthcare, education, public safety, defense. And to really materialize the vision, what's expected from AR, VR, we have to start with a more natural experience and equipment that can enable a more natural interaction with this AR, VR environment, which is wireless over Wi-Fi, right? So this new capacity with 6 gigahertz not only can deal with the demand of traffic on that network, but also the latency, right? Making any kind of blips on the connection imperceptible to humans. So maybe I'll stop there and see. Maybe I'll start with you, Danielle. What do you think about the promise of 6 gigahertz?
Sure, thanks, Edgar. You really hit it right on the head. I think to give folks some context, before the 6 gigahertz decision, the only way that network operators could access even one 160 megahertz channel, which is the channel needed for next generation Wi-Fi 6 technology, under acceptable technical rules, was really to cobble together 2 different 80 megahertz chunks from different parts of the 5 gigahertz range, and that was still just one channel. And so, this decision to open up 7 contiguous 160 megahertz channels will just be transformative. I think we'll see these wide channels used more often. It'll improve throughput and capacity on our Wi-Fi networks, as Edgar highlighted, and enable exciting new high bandwidth applications like the augmented and virtual reality types of applications that Edgar mentioned. just to give you a sense of what we expect, we think that these 7 new 160 megahertz channels could double Wi-Fi speeds and cut latency in half compared to Wi-Fi 5. I've seen that there's one new chip out there that can deliver 2 gigabits per second of real-world speeds, up to 5 times better battery utilization, improved coverage, and less than a millisecond in latency. So these are really significant improvements over the last generation of Wi-Fi, which we've all used and experienced, and it's really good. So I think the future is bright in terms of what that 1200 megahertz of spectrum can enable, both in terms of improvements for our existing Wi-Fi technologies, but also for enabling the next generation of Wi-Fi innovations. Edgar really talked a little bit about how Wi-Fi is really a cost-effective technology that enables innovation. These Wi-Fi bands, these unlicensed spectrum bands, have for decades been sort of sandboxes, playgrounds for innovators to develop new technologies, which they can do so long as they can access that spectrum for free, so long as those devices are abiding by the FCC's technical rules. And so that's resulted in a whole bunch of unlicensed technologies. We've talked a lot about Wi-Fi today, but there's Bluetooth, there's RFID, there's Zigbee and LoRa, and all sorts of different unlicensed technologies that have found a home in these bands because of the low barriers to entry. So again, with even more transformative spectrum available, I think we'll continue to see innovations in this space too.
Great, thanks, Danielle. Christina, any thoughts on 6 gigahertz?
I mean, just to echo what you guys are saying, the obvious innovation that's coming through the band from the actual broadband perspective, 6 gigahertz is actually utilized right now on a licensed basis for backhaul. So that should indicate the speed and the capacity of this band on the outdoor basis and on the fixed wireless side. Just opening that up for deployment to the home, the last mile, it's just going to be a game changer, significant game changer for what it means for capacity and speeds for the largely rural and remote consumer we were discussing earlier. It's some are talking doubling of speeds. So it's fantastic. We're really excited for this.
Right, and I'm wondering, Christina, so one thing that I think Danielle mentioned, right, is this automated frequency coordination system that will be an integral component of, the 6 gigahertz era, since it's part of the rulemaking. Is that something that is also being accounted for in the calculus at places like WISPA?
Oh, absolutely. This obviously it's a little bit of a nascent design coordination. It's I think the first instance we've seen of this very complex coordination is in CBRS Span using SAS, where we're coordinating on it. That's a very complex example of this. This is a lot less complex. The AFC regime that's going to be deployed is obviously something that they're continuing to work on to ensure that it's done properly, but it's not quite as complex as the SAS in CBRS Span. So we expect it to not be as the latency issues that could possibly come around it are null. There are expectations of this being implemented seamlessly, and that so long as folks are using the proper protocols, that it's going to work just fine. It's going to be great.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to hear that you're planning for that. Let's see, there is, I'm just going through quickly here a question. Us and the rest of the world move to the other side of COVID-19. How do you anticipate the exponential growth of Wi-Fi to continue in a post-pandemic world? Do you anticipate that the increased use cases and utilization will continue? And what will drive that growth? So I can start. So obviously, as I mentioned, during my piece, the Wi-Fi community has done a good job of staying ahead of the demand, innovating to add new intelligent techniques to deal more dynamically with traffic demands. One thing that some of the speakers repeated was there's absolutely going to be some of these new demands on the network that are going to linger and probably will be part of the new normal after COVID-19. Just to pick at one area, right? I thought it was amazingly just terrific what we were able to do with telehealth during this period, right? With we had some examples in the past of Wi-Fi being used to deliver telehealth in remote areas and making that very economical. But now, the efficiency and facility of doctors, experts even, to be able to reach folks in very remote areas and to just be accustomed to being that as, having that as one of the toolkits one of the tools in the toolkit that they can rely on to offer services everywhere. It's something that it's so beneficial, and it had to be triggered by a catalyst like the COVID-19 pandemic. It was an experiment that only could have happened or have been precipitated by us being forced into that mode. But there's so much goodness there that was revealed that's likely to remain. So that's just an example. Danielle or Christina, any other examples you might want to share?
Jump in. You use telehealth, which is a great example. I think remote work is another. You've seen a lot of companies come out recently saying, look, we've seen that this works for us. This works for our bottom line. This works for our employees. We're gonna keep an aspect of remote work going forward, whether it's a few days a week or moving to a full-time remote model. And so I think we'll continue to see innovations around remote work, as people have kind of remote presence in offices. Some people will be working remotely, maybe somebody won't. And facilitating those kinds of interactions in new and dynamic ways will continue to require access to spectrum. So I think that's just another example of where we'll continue to see the increased kind of overall demand for Wi-Fi even after the pandemic. But also kind of a space for new innovations that might also be bandwidth intensive. One thing we haven't really talked about yet today is that, while we're planning for these 7 new 160 megahertz channels to bring those online, it's possible that the next Wi-Fi standard that folks are looking at and planning for could adopt 320 megahertz channels, right? As we're planning for, again, these very bandwidth heavy applications, that require very high throughput, very low latency, the channel size will continue to grow. So, it's important to think about not just the 5.9 and 6 gigahertz bands, how do we bring those online? How do we improve access to the spectrum that we have? But also, continuing to consider the spectrum pipeline that we need to enable even more growth in Wi-Fi and other unlicensed technologies down the road.
Good point. Yes. So, Christina, feel free to jump in. Otherwise,
just echoing what you guys were saying and just putting on the connectivity, the broadband context of telehealth, the expanded work from home. Folks are expecting higher speeds and need more connectivity, period. I mean, we're still dealing with, from the WISPA perspective, there are still unserved communities. So I think sometimes we gloss in these infrastructure discussions talking about getting folks from, 50 by 5 to 100 by 100 symmetrical. We're leaving behind the folks who don't even get 5 meg down. And that's kind of our crew. That's who we're servicing, that we're bringing high-speed connectivity. 100 meg down when you didn't even have 5 is life-changing. And that's the impact, I think, going forward. We'll see post-pandemic that folks are going to demand this connectivity no matter where they are. So while we are talking about these urban and suburban communities, we have to remember that we also have to keep the remote and rural folks at the table.
Right, that's a very good point. I think we were carrying the flag and mentioning a lot about how Wi-Fi is essential to the infrastructure and really the operation of our economy and our society. But the pandemic just made that extremely obvious for everyone. So good point. So maybe we just have time for one more question here. We have Graham who asks, need more unlicensed spectrum, but to realize full potential of Wi-Fi, how much protection can be or should be regulated or provided to ensure Wi-Fi does work at full potential? Do we need more oriented rules to prevent interference?
So I can jump in and take that one, Edgar, if you'd like. Forgive me, it's not immediately clear from the question if we're talking about interference to existing services who already occupy the bands where Wi-Fi shares, or if you're talking about kind of intro Wi-Fi interference amongst Wi-Fi itself. So I might take kind of both of those in order. I think Wi-Fi has for many years been a shared access technology Wi-Fi builds in protocols both to share with others and to share with other Wi-Fi devices in a fair and access the medium in a fair way. So I think we've got decades of success doing that in a variety of different spectrum bands, and that'll continue to be a hallmark of unlicensed access down the road. Unlicensed bands are kind of like public parks. They're public goods. Anybody can come and operate in those bands so long as they abide by the rules. And so you've got to be those rules, whether they be FCC technical rules or built into the Wi-Fi standard itself. Those rules have to make sure that there's kind of fair access to the band. FCC rules do that today by adopting fairly low power levels, right? Wi-Fi power levels are lower than for typically exclusive licensed spectrum bands. And part of that is to facilitate spectrum reuse and ensure that a variety of different users can operate using the same spectrum. At the same time, as Edgar mentioned earlier, the Wi-Fi standard has been evolving to enable better coexistence, better sharing, more capacity for users on the network. In some cases, implementing features that were kind of first innovated in the kind of 3GPP world. So I think we'll continue to see innovations that make spectrum access work in a shared unlicensed environment. Again, some of that will be for the Wi-Fi users themselves and how we kind of all share the spectrum together. Some of that will be in terms of innovations like the automated frequency coordination system that enable shared access to the band with other users who, again, with no greenfield spectrum available, we're all looking to make robust and efficient use of the spectrum resources that we have. And so, putting an unlicensed overlay across other bands where we can facilitate shared use and protect existing users from harmful interference, that makes a lot of sense for everybody. And I think we'll continue to see innovation in that area as the world moves forward and continues to innovate to make robust and efficient use of these spectrum resources.
Thanks, Danielle. Anything to add, Christina? You may get the last word. Great. So
no, that was a perfect answer.
Exactly. And all right, so we're right at time. So I want to once again thank everyone for joining. Thanks in particular to ML Strategies who helped us get coordinated here, to NCTA and WISPA, in particular to Danielle and Christina for very informative presentations. And we hope to see everyone at a future event that we will host again. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Be safe.